Welcome to Cafe Tales. Tonight we journey to St. Mary Mead in the summer of 1934, where beneath the willow tree a villager is found murdered. Secrets spread, lies unravel, and only Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human weakness, can see what others overlook. Stay with us until the very end, for only then will the true murderer be revealed. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these stories and the work I do here, please consider subscribing to the channel. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see where our detective community is gathered tonight. Now settle in with a hot cup of coffee. Stay curious, and let's unfold this mystery together. Chapter 1. Beneath the Weeping Willow. The late roses were proving rather stubborn this year, Miss Jane Marple reflected as she knelt beside her garden border, secateurs in hand. September had arrived with an unusual persistence of summer warmth, and her climbing rose, a particularly fine specimen of Lady Hillingdon, seemed reluctant to acknowledge that autumn was upon St. Mary Mead. She snipped carefully at a stem, her practiced eye noting the telltale signs of black spot on the lower leaves. One must be vigilant about these things, she murmured to herself, a habit she had developed over the years of solitary gardening. A small problem ignored becomes a large problem later. The morning mist hung low over the village, lending an ethereal quality to the familiar landscape. From her position by the rosebed, Miss Marple could just glimpse the spire of St. Mary's Church through the gossamer veil, its ancient stones appearing to float like something from a medieval painting. It was the sort of morning that invited contemplation, the kind that made one appreciate the enduring peace of village life. That tranquility was shattered by the rapid clip-clop of heels on the garden path, accompanied by the rustling of hastily donned clothing and labored breathing that could only belong to one person. Jane. Oh, Jane, thank goodness you're up and about so early. Miss Marple set down her secateurs with deliberate care and rose from her kneeling position, brushing a few fragments of soil from her gardening gloves. Mrs. Dolly Bantry stood at the garden gate, her usually immaculate appearance somewhat disheveled. Her hair, normally arranged in perfect waves, had been hastily pinned, and her cardigan was buttoned incorrectly. "Good morning, Dolly dear," Miss Marple said mildly. "You seem rather agitated this morning. Do come in and have some tea." "Oh, I couldn't possibly sit still for tea, not with all this dreadful business." Mrs. Bantry pushed through the gate with characteristic determination. "Jane, something quite awful has happened. There's been a death, a terrible accident by the willow pond behind Old Rectory Lane." Miss Marple's expression grew more attentive. Deaths in St. Mary Mead, whether accidental or otherwise, were mercifully rare occurrences that inevitably disrupted the gentle rhythm of village life. "What sort of accident, my dear?" "It's that clockmaker fellow, Arthur Reeves. Martha found him this morning when she was doing her early rounds. He's lying beneath that great weeping willow with his neck broken." Mrs. Bantry's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "Dr. Haydock says he must have fallen from the tree, though what on earth a man of his age was doing climbing trees in the dark is beyond anyone's comprehension." Miss Marple considered this information with the careful attention she might have, devoted to a particularly complex knitting pattern. Arthur Reeves was a name she had heard mentioned in recent weeks, though she had not yet made the gentleman's acquaintance personally. "When was Mr. Reeves discovered?" "Not half an hour ago. Martha was taking her usual path by the pond. You know how she likes that route for her morning constitutional. And there he was." Mrs. Bantry shuddered delicately. "She said at first she thought it was just an old coat someone had left behind, but then she saw. Well, she saw what it really was." The two ladies made their way through the village, their footsteps echoing softly on the damp cobblestones. As they walked, Mrs. Bantry provided additional details with the thoroughness of someone who had already gathered considerable intelligence from various sources. Inspector Slack has been summoned, of course, though Dr. Haydock seems quite certain it was simply a tragic accident. Poor Mr. Reeves must have been attempting to retrieve something from the tree, perhaps a bird's nest or some such thing, and lost his footing in the darkness. Miss Marple noted this theory with interest, but reserved judgment. In her extensive experience of village life, she had observed that the most obvious explanations were not always the most accurate ones. They turned onto the narrow lane that led toward the pond area, where a small crowd had already gathered at a respectful distance from the scene. Miss Marple could see Martha Price standing beside Dr. Haydock, her usually composed demeanor thoroughly shaken. The village constable was attempting to maintain order while awaiting the arrival of Inspector Slack from the county headquarters. As they approached the ancient willow tree, Miss Marple studied the scene with her characteristic attention to detail. Arthur Reeves lay in an unnatural position beneath the trailing branches, his body twisted at an angle that spoke eloquently of the violence of his end. His clothes showed signs of dampness from the morning dew, suggesting he had been there for several hours. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said quietly as they drew near, "what is your professional assessment of the situation?" The doctor looked up from his examination with a grave expression. "From all appearances, Miss Marple, it seems Mr. Reeves suffered a fatal fall sometime during the night. The immediate cause of death appears to be a broken neck, consistent with falling from a considerable height." Miss Marple walked slowly around the perimeter of the scene, her keen eyes taking in details that others might overlook. The ground around the base of the willow was soft with accumulated leaf mold and the previous night's moisture. Yet there were remarkably few signs of disturbance beyond the area immediately surrounding the body. "It's curious," she murmured to Dr. Haydock, "that a man would choose to climb a tree on such a misty evening. The visibility would have been quite poor indeed, though perhaps he was responding to some emergency, a cat in distress or some such thing. People sometimes act impulsively in such situations." Miss Marple noticed that Arthur Reeves's shoes were remarkably clean for someone who had supposedly climbed a tree in muddy conditions. Moreover, the pattern of dampness on his clothing seemed inconsistent with a body that had lain exposed to the night air for several hours. "Dr. Haydock," she said thoughtfully, "would you say Mr. Reeves was an active gentleman, the sort who might habitually engage in physical activities like tree climbing?" "Not particularly, no. He was approaching 60 and suffered from a slight arthritis in his hands, an occupational hazard of clockmaking, I believe. I wouldn't have expected him to attempt such a feat under normal circumstances." The arrival of Inspector Slack interrupted their quiet conversation. He approached the scene with his customary air of brisk efficiency, though Miss Marple noted that his usual confidence seemed somewhat strained by the early hour and unusual circumstances. "Right then," he announced after a cursory examination of the body, "appears to be a straightforward case of accidental death. Poor fellow must have been attempting to retrieve something from the tree and lost his balance. These elderly gentlemen sometimes overestimate their physical capabilities." Miss Marple observed the inspector's preliminary investigation with interest, noting that his attention focused primarily on the immediate area around the body rather than the broader scene. She had learned through numerous unfortunate experiences that initial assumptions often prove to be the most dangerous obstacles to understanding the truth. As the morning progressed and the necessary official procedures began, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the various questions that Arthur Reeves's death raised. The more she considered the circumstances, the more she began to suspect that the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead was about to be confronted with mysteries that extended far beyond a simple accident beneath an ancient willow tree. The great tree itself stood sentinel over the grim discovery, its trailing branches moving gently in the morning breeze, as though keeping secrets that only the most patient observer might hope to understand. Chapter 2. The Clockmaker's Questions. The news of Arthur Reeves's death had spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that characterized all significant village events. By mid-morning, Miss Marple found herself the recipient of several Visitors, each bearing additional fragments of information about the deceased clockmaker and his recent activities in the village. The first to arrive was Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who appeared at Miss Marple's garden gate with the measured stride of someone bearing important intelligence. "Such a dreadful business about poor Mr. Reeves," she announced, settling herself in the offered garden chair with evident relief. "Leonard is quite shaken by the whole affair. He feels responsible, you know, having encouraged Mr. Reeves to take those evening walks for his health." Miss Marple poured tea from the pot she had optimistically prepared for visitors. "The vicar recommended evening exercise?" "Oh, yes." Mr. Reeves had been complaining of difficulty sleeping since his wife's death. Leonard suggested that a constitutional before bedtime might help settle his mind. Mrs. Clement accepted her teacup with a grateful nod. Though one does wonder what possessed him to venture so close to that pond in the darkness. "Perhaps he was following a familiar route," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "That's just it." According to Leonard, Mr. Reeves had only recently begun taking those particular walks. He'd been asking quite detailed questions about the various paths around the village, particularly those that passed near the old properties and historical sites. Miss Marple's attention sharpened with interest. "Historical sites?" "Yes." He seemed particularly fascinated by the wartime installations. "You remember that old air raid shelter that used to be near the pond area?" Mr. Reeves had been asking about its exact location, when it was built, that sort of thing. Mrs. Clement frowned slightly. "Rather an unusual hobby for a clockmaker, I thought." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Peter Wynne, the young curate, who appeared at the garden gate in a state of considerable agitation. His thin face was pale, and his hands trembled visibly as he approached. "Mrs. Clement, Miss Marple," he began without preamble. "I fear I must tell someone about my conversation with Mr. Reeves yesterday evening. I've been quite unable to sleep, wondering if I should have done something differently." Miss Marple gestured toward an empty chair. "Please, Mr. Wynne, do sit down and tell us what's troubling you." "Mr. Reeves called at the vicarage around 7 ohm yesterday," the curate explained, perching nervously on the edge of his seat. "He wanted to discuss certain irregularities he claimed to have discovered regarding church property." "What sort of irregularities?" Mrs. Clement inquired with evident concern. "He believed that some of our valuable brass fittings had been replaced with inferior copies. He'd brought a magnifying glass and had been examining various pieces quite closely." Peter Wynne's voice grew more strained. He seemed to think someone with regular access to the church had been systematically removing original items. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "And what was your response to these allegations?" "I told him such accusations were quite serious and shouldn't be made lightly. He insisted he had the expertise to detect such substitutions, given his background in metalwork and clockmaking." The curate's hands wrung together anxiously. "He said he intended to document his findings and present them to the proper authorities." "Did he mention any specific suspicions about who might be responsible?" "Not directly, but he did ask rather pointed questions about who had keys to the church and who was responsible for maintenance tasks. When I mentioned that George Atkins handles most of our repairs and upkeep, Mr. Reeves became quite interested." Miss Marple noted this information with the same care she devoted to cataloging the varieties in her rose garden. "And how did you leave matters with Mr. Reeves?" "He said he wanted to gather more evidence before making formal accusations. I advised him to be very certain of his facts before proceeding." Peter Wynne looked up with evident distress. "I keep wondering if I should have taken his concerns more seriously or perhaps warned him to be more cautious in his investigations." The afternoon brought another visitor in the form of Malcolm Ridley, the village's most energetic estate agent. He arrived with his usual confidence, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension in his manner that suggested he was less comfortable than he appeared. "Terrible news about Mr. Reeves," he declared, settling himself without invitation. though I must admit his recent behavior had become rather challenging from a business perspective. "In what way, Mr. Ridley?" Miss Marple inquired with polite interest. "He'd been interfering with my development plans for the old Rectory Lane area, kept raising questions about historical usage rights and wartime installations that, frankly, had no bearing on current property law." Ridley's frustration was evident despite his attempt at professional composure. "I'd invested considerable time and resources in surveying that land, only to have him stirring up complications about boundary disputes and archaeological concerns." Archaeological concerns. He claimed the area might contain significant wartime artifacts that would require preservation. Complete nonsense, of course, but the sort of delay that could cost me thousands of pounds in lost opportunities. Miss Marple observed that Mr. Ridley's concern seemed more focused on financial implications than on the tragic loss of life. "Did you consider his interference a serious threat to your business interests?" "Annoying rather than threatening," Ridley replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "However, I did wonder about his real motivations. One doesn't typically show such intense interest in property matters without some personal stake involved." As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the various accounts she had heard throughout the day. Arthur Reeves emerged from these conversations as a man who had been asking uncomfortable questions about matters that others preferred to leave undisturbed. His clockmaker's expertise had apparently led him to suspect theft from the church, while his interest in local history had put him at odds with commercial development plans. Dr. Haydock's evening visit provided additional context to her growing understanding of the situation. "I've completed my preliminary examination," he announced, accepting the chair by the window that had become his customary spot during their discussions. "The cause of death is certainly consistent with a fall, though there are some aspects of the scene that I find somewhat puzzling, such as the positioning of the body. For one thing, if Mr. Reeves had fallen directly from the tree, I would have expected him to land closer to the trunk. Instead, he was found several feet away near the water's edge." Miss Marple considered this detail carefully. "Could he have been attempting to break his fall?" "Possibly, though the trajectory seems odd. Also, his clothing showed remarkably little evidence of contact with tree bark or branches, which one might expect from someone who had been climbing." "What does Inspector Slack make of these observations?" Dr. Haydock's expression suggested some frustration with the official investigation. "The inspector remains convinced this was a simple accident. He scheduled the inquest for Friday and expects it to be a straightforward proceeding." As the doctor took his leave, Miss Marple remained seated by her drawing-room window, watching the shadows lengthen across the village green. The death of Arthur Reeves was beginning to appear less like a tragic accident and more like the culmination of conflicts that had been building beneath the peaceful surface of St. Mary Mead. The clockmaker's questions about church property and local history had clearly made several people uncomfortable, and his systematic approach to gathering evidence suggested he had been building towards some sort of revelation. Whether that revelation had died with him remained to be seen, but Miss Marple suspected that the truth had a way of surfacing eventually, regardless of the circumstances surrounding its discoverer's fate. Chapter 3. Whispers and Warnings. Prowse. Second morning following Arthur Reeves's death brought with it a crispness that spoke definitively of autumn's arrival. Miss Marple, having completed her morning routine of tending to the more delicate plants in her greenhouse, found herself with an unexpected visitor in the form of Mrs. Martha Price, the village postwoman. Martha was a woman of considerable efficiency, who prided herself on knowing the personal correspondence habits of every household in St. Mary Mead, a knowledge that proved invaluable for those seeking to understand the subtle currents of village life. "Miss Marple," Martha began without preamble, settling her substantial frame into the offered garden chair. "I've been thinking about Mr. Reeves's death, and there's something that's been bothering me considerably." Miss Marple poured tea from the pot she had optimistically prepared for two. "Do tell me, Martha. I find your observations invariably enlightening." "Well, it's about Mr. Reeves's recent activities, you see," I deliver posts to every house in the village, and I couldn't help but notice he'd been receiving quite a lot of correspondence from London, official-looking letters from banks and solicitors. Martha accepted her teacup with a grateful nod. More curious still, he'd been posting letters to various churches and historical societies, asking about brasswork and church records. "How very thorough of him," Miss Marple murmured. "That's not all, though. 3 times in the past fortnight I saw him coming away from Sarah Larkin's cottage, and each time she seemed more nervous than before." Martha leaned forward conspiratorially. "I happened to overhear part of their last conversation purely by accident, you understand. As I was delivering the afternoon post, he was asking her about her time in London, about the clock repair shop where she used to work." This information provided a new dimension to Miss Marple's understanding of the situation. "I wasn't aware that Mrs. Larkin had worked in London." "Oh, yes, before she came back to the village after her husband's death. She was quite skilled with delicate repair work, I'm told. Worked for a prestigious establishment in Bloomsbury." Martha's voice dropped to a confidential whisper. Mr. Reeves seemed to know a great deal about her employment there, which struck me as rather odd for someone who'd only recently moved to the village. Miss Marple filed this detail away with characteristic precision. "And how did Mrs. Larkin respond to his inquiries?" "That's just it. She kept insisting she couldn't remember much about those days, that the grief of losing her husband had affected her memory. But I've known Sarah since she was a girl, and she's got a mind like a steel trap when it comes to details." Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of George Atkins, the village handyman, who approached the garden gate with the measured stride of a man who had learned to pace himself over many years of physical labor. He was a tall, angular figure whose weather-beaten face bore the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," he said, touching his flat cap respectfully, "but I wanted to let you know. I'll be working on your garden shed tomorrow morning, fixing that loose board you mentioned." "How thoughtful of you to remember, Mr. Atkins. Would 9 hours be convenient?" "Perfect, miss. I'll have finished my early work at the church by then." He paused, glancing toward Martha with evident reluctance. "Terrible business about Mr. Reeves. I hope they find out what really happened to the poor fellow." Martha studied him with undisguised interest. "You were working at the church early the morning he was found, weren't you, George?" "I saw the light in the tower room when I found him." "That's right. I've been having trouble with the clock mechanism lately. Running slow. It has been delicate work that requires good light, so I start early." Atkins shifted, uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "I didn't see anything unusual, if that's what you're getting at." "I wasn't suggesting anything of the sort," Martha replied with dignified innocence. "Though I did notice you'd left quite a bit of brass filings on the church porch. Quite a mess, actually." A curious expression crossed Atkins's weathered features. Something that might have been annoyance or perhaps anxiety. "Brass filings from your work on the clock, I presume, though it did seem rather a lot for simple maintenance work." Miss Marple observed this exchange with the quiet attention of someone watching a particularly interesting species of bird. In her extensive experience of village life, she had learned that the most significant conversations often occurred in seemingly casual encounters. "Clock's been giving me considerable trouble," Atkins said defensively. "Some of the brass components have been corroding, needed proper cleaning and adjustment. Makes quite a bit of filing and polishing work. Well, I'd best be getting on," he added abruptly. "Good day to you both." As his footsteps receded down the lane, Martha shook her head, with evident disapproval. "There's something not quite right about that man lately. Always was a bit secretive, but these past weeks he's been positively jumpy." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Sarah Larkin herself, who appeared at the garden gate with the hesitant manner of someone who was not entirely certain of her welcome. She was a woman in her early 30s with prematurely worried lines around her eyes and hands that showed the telltale signs of needlework, the occupation that supported her small household. "Miss Marple," she began nervously, "I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced. I wanted to speak with someone about Mr. Reeves's death. The police have been asking questions, and I'm not certain what I should tell them." Miss Marple invited her to sit and poured fresh tea, noting the young woman's obvious distress. "What sort of questions have they been asking, my dear?" "About my connection to Mr. Reeves, about the work we did together in London." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she accepted her teacup. "The thing is, Miss Marple, there are aspects of that time in my life that I'd rather not discuss. Not because I've done anything wrong, you understand, but because some memories are too painful to revisit. I quite understand. Grief affects people in different ways. Mr. Reeves seemed to think I should remember more about our work together than I actually do. He kept asking about specific clients, particular pieces we'd worked on, financial arrangements." Sarah's voice trailed off uncertainly. "He seemed to suspect that something irregular had occurred at the shop. Though I can't imagine what." Miss Marple leaned forward with gentle interest. "Did he make any specific allegations?" "Not directly, but he implied that valuable items might have gone missing, or that there had been some sort of substitution of genuine pieces with copies." Sarah looked genuinely puzzled. "I told him repeatedly that I was just a junior employee who worked on routine repairs. I wouldn't have had access to the sort of information he was seeking. And yet he continued to press you for details." "Yes, and it was becoming quite uncomfortable. I finally told him that if he had serious concerns about past irregularities, he should contact the police rather than harassing someone who couldn't help him." As evening approached and Sarah Larkin took her leave, Miss Marple found herself standing once again by her drawing-room window, observing the lengthening shadows across the village green. The conversations of the day had revealed a complex web of relationships and anxieties that seemed to center around Arthur Reeves's persistent inquiries into matters that others preferred to leave undisturbed. The pattern that was emerging suggested that Reeves's clockmaker expertise had led him to suspect irregularities not only in the church's brass fittings, but also in his former London establishment. His methodical approach to gathering evidence had clearly made several people uncomfortable, and his recent death had occurred just as he seemed to be building towards some sort of revelation. The autumn air carried with it a sense of change and unrest that extended far beyond the normal rhythms of seasonal transition. In Miss Marple's long experience, such atmospheres rarely dissipated without some form of dramatic resolution, and she found herself hoping that whatever additional secrets lay buried in St. Mary Mead would surface before more innocent parties became entangled in their consequences. Chapter 4. The Silent Witness. The third morning following Arthur Reeves's death dawned with the peculiar quality of light that often precedes significant discoveries, crystal clear yet somehow ominous, as though nature itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple had risen earlier than usual, troubled by dreams she could not quite recall, but which left her with a persistent sense that the village's troubles were far from resolved. She was tending to her early chrysanthemums when the sound of hurried footsteps on the cobblestones drew her attention. Dr. Haydock appeared at her garden gate, his medical bag in hand and his usually composed demeanor showing signs of considerable strain. "Miss Marple," he called urgently, "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes to accompany me on a rather delicate professional matter. Your experience with children could prove invaluable." Miss Marple set down her watering can with deliberate care, though her pulse had quickened considerably. "What sort of matter, doctor?" "Young Tommy Larkin has been found in a most distressing condition. His mother discovered him this morning huddled in the garden shed, apparently having spent the night there. He appears physically unharmed, but he's in a state of complete shock and refuses to speak to anyone." Within minutes, Miss Marple found herself walking briskly toward the Larkin cottage, accompanied by Dr. Haydock, who provided additional details. As they made their way through the village, Sarah is beside herself with worry, he explained. Tommy disappeared sometime after supper yesterday evening. She assumed he was playing in the garden as usual, but when bedtime came, he was nowhere to be found. She spent half the night searching before finally discovering him this morning. And his condition, that's what's most troubling. The boy appears to have witnessed something profoundly disturbing. He's exhibiting all the classic signs of severe psychological trauma, complete withdrawal, inability to speak, and an almost catatonic state of fear. They approached the modest cottage with its well-tended front garden, where Miss Marple could see through the front window that Sarah Larkin was pacing back and forth with obvious distress. Dr. Haydock knocked gently, and they were admitted immediately. "Oh, Dr. Haydock, thank goodness you've come," Sarah said, her voice barely controlled. "And Miss Marple, how kind of you to come as well. I simply don't know what to do with him." Miss Marple's attention immediately focused on the small figure, huddled in the large armchair by the window. Tommy Larkin, normally a quiet but alert 8-year-old, sat perfectly still with his legs drawn up to his chest, his dark eyes staring straight ahead with the peculiar fixity of someone who had seen something beyond their ability to comprehend. Most significantly, Miss Marple noticed that the child's clothes were dirty and damp, and his small shoes were covered with a fine gray dust that was distinctly different from the ordinary garden soil she would have expected. "Tommy, dear," she said gently, settling herself in a nearby chair. "I'm Miss Marple. I live in the cottage with the lovely roses that you sometimes admire when you walk past." The boy's eyes flickered toward her for just a moment before returning to their fixed stare. But Miss Marple noted that he had heard and recognized her voice. Dr. Haydock conducted a careful examination while Miss Marple observed the child's reactions. "Physically, he appears unharmed," the doctor confirmed quietly. "No injuries, no signs of violence, but psychologically he's clearly experienced severe trauma." "Has he spoken at all since he was found?" Miss Marple inquired. "Not a word," Sarah replied, wringing her hands anxiously. "He just sits there clutching that little wooden boat his father made for him and won't respond to anything I say." Miss Marple noticed that Tommy's grip on the wooden toy was so tight that his knuckles were white and small flakes of paint had come off in his hands. "Mrs. Larkin," she said thoughtfully, "you mentioned that Tommy disappeared yesterday evening. Do you recall what time this was?" "Sometime after 7. I had finished clearing up after supper and assumed he was playing in the back garden as he usually does before bedtime." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "When I called him in at 8:30, he was simply gone." Dr. Haydock exchanged a meaningful glance with Miss Marple. The timing was significant. Arthur Reeves's death had occurred sometime during the night between Tuesday and Wednesday, and if Tommy had witnessed whatever had actually happened by the Willow Pond, it would explain both his disappearance and his current traumatized state. "Has Tommy ever stayed out all night before?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Never. He's always been a timid child, rather afraid of the dark. The idea of him spending the night outdoors?" Sarah shuddered. Something terrible must have happened to frighten him so badly. Miss Marple approached the boy's chair slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that frightened children required infinite patience. "Tommy," she said softly, "I can see that you're holding your father's boat very tightly. It must be a great comfort to you when you're feeling scared or worried." For the first time since their arrival, the boy's expression shifted slightly, though he still did not speak. "Sometimes," Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone, "when we've seen things that upset us, it helps to tell someone about them. Not everything all at once, perhaps, but just little bits when we feel ready." Tommy's grip on the wooden boat loosened fractionally, and Miss Marple was encouraged to see that he was listening. Dr. Haydock, recognizing the delicate nature of the situation, gestured for Sarah to step into the kitchen with him, leaving Miss Marple alone with the traumatized child. "You know, Tommy," she said conversationally, settling back in her chair, I've noticed that your shoes have quite a lot of gray dust on them. That's rather curious because most of the soil around here is brown, especially near the pond where people like to walk. The boy's eyes darted nervously toward his feet, then back to the fixed point he had been staring at. I wonder, Miss Marple mused aloud, if you might have visited somewhere with a different sort of ground, perhaps somewhere where people work with metal or stone, where there might be dust from grinding or filing. Tommy's entire body tensed at these words, and Miss Marple knew she had touched upon something significant. When Dr. Haydock and Sarah returned from their whispered conference in the kitchen, Miss Marple rose to meet them with a grave expression. I believe Tommy has indeed witnessed something connected to Mr. Reeves's death, she said quietly. The timing of his disappearance, his current condition, and certain physical evidence all suggest that he was present at or near the scene when whatever actually happened to Mr. Reeves took place. But surely, Sarah protested, if Tommy had seen Mr. Reeves fall from the tree, he would have run for help immediately. Miss Marple's expression grew more thoughtful. That would depend, my dear, on exactly what he saw. If Mr. Reeves's death was not the simple accident that Inspector Slack believes it to be, then Tommy may have witnessed something far more disturbing than a tragic fall. As they prepared to leave the cottage with arrangements made for Dr. Haydock to return later in the day, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the implications of Tommy's condition. The child's traumatized state, combined with the gray dust on his shoes and the timing of his disappearance, suggested that St. Mary Mead was harboring a secret far darker than anyone had yet imagined. The peaceful village morning continued around them, but Miss Marple could sense the undercurrents of fear and deception that lay beneath the surface, waiting for someone with sufficient patience and understanding to coax the truth from a frightened child who held the key to solving Arthur Reeves's murder. Chapter 5. The investigation deepens. By afternoon, news of Tommy Larkin's mysterious disappearance and traumatized condition had reached Inspector Slack, who arrived at the village hall, with renewed interest in what he had previously dismissed as a straightforward accidental death. Miss Marple, having observed the morning's events with her customary discretion, found herself summoned to provide background information about the village's recent atmosphere, an invitation she accepted with appropriate gravity. Now then, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack began, consulting his notebook with the air of a man whose simple case had suddenly become considerably more complex. This business with the Larkin boy puts a rather different complexion on things. If the child witnessed Mr. Reeves's death, we need to understand exactly what he saw. Miss Marple settled herself in the uncomfortable wooden chair with the patience of someone accustomed to official interrogations. I'm afraid Tommy remains unable to speak about his experience. Dr. Haydock believes it may take considerable time and gentle encouragement before the boy can articulate what he witnessed. Yes. Well, we can't base an investigation on the silence of a traumatized child, Slack replied with evident frustration. But his condition does suggest that Mr. Reeves's death may not have been as straightforward as it initially appeared. The inspector had already begun a more thorough examination of potential suspects, starting with those who had demonstrated particular interest in Arthur Reeves's recent activities. His first interview was with Peter Wynne, the nervous curate, who arrived at the village hall in an even more agitated state than Miss Marple had previously observed. Inspector, Peter began before taking his seat, I've been quite unable to sleep since learning about the Larkin boy's condition. I keep wondering if there was something more I should have done when Mr. Reeves came to me with his concerns. Slack looked up with renewed attention. You mentioned previously that Mr. Reeves suspected irregularities with church property. Can you be more specific about his allegations? He believed that several valuable brass pieces had been systematically replaced with inferior copies over the past few years. He claimed he could detect the difference through his professional expertise. Peter Wynne's hands trembled as he spoke. When I suggested he contact the police if he had serious concerns, he said he preferred to gather more concrete evidence first. Did he indicate how he planned to obtain this evidence? Mentioned conducting a more thorough examination of the church fittings, possibly during off hours when he wouldn't be disturbed. He also spoke of comparing the current pieces with old photographs from our parish records. Inspector Slack made careful notes. And you say he was particularly interested in who had access to the church? Yes, he asked detailed questions about keys, maintenance schedules, and who was responsible for various types of repair work. When I mentioned George Atkins handles most of our metalwork and clock maintenance, Mr. Reeves became quite focused on that information. Following Peter Wynn's departure, Inspector Slack interviewed Malcolm Ridley, who maintained his usual professional composure, despite the obvious tension in his manner. Inspector, Ridley began, while I certainly had business disagreements with Mr. Reeves, I want to make it clear that I would never have wished him any physical harm. What was the nature of these disagreements? He was interfering with legitimate development plans based on what I consider to be frivolous historical concerns. His questions about wartime installations and boundary disputes were threatening to delay projects that could benefit the entire village. Ridley's frustration was evident despite his attempted diplomacy. Were these delays costing you money? Potentially, yes. But more importantly, they were preventing improvements that could bring additional housing and economic opportunities to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple observed that Mr. Ridley's emphasis on community benefits seemed somewhat at odds with his obvious personal investment in the project's success. The most significant interview proved to be with George Atkins, who arrived at the village hall with obvious reluctance and an air of defensive hostility that immediately aroused Inspector Slack's suspicions. Mr. Atkins, the inspector began formally, I understand you have regular access to the church and are responsible for maintaining the clock mechanism. Been doing that job for 15 years without complaint, Atkins replied curtly. Don't see what. It has to do with Mr. Reeves's accident. We're no longer certain it was an accident. The Larkin boy's condition suggests he may have witnessed something more deliberate. Atkins's weathered face paled noticeably. That's a serious accusation, Inspector. I'm not making accusations, merely exploring possibilities. Can you account for your whereabouts on the evening Mr. Reeves died? Home in my cottage, same as always. Don't have anyone who can vouch for that if that's what you're getting at. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. Mrs. Price mentioned observing brass filings on the church porch recently. Can you explain the source of that debris? Clock mechanism's been giving me trouble. Some of the brass components needed cleaning and adjustment. Atkins's defensive tone grew more pronounced. Makes quite a bit of filing work when you're dealing with corroded metal. Were you aware that Mr. Reeves had expressed concerns about the church's brass fittings? Heard rumors to that effect. Man seemed to think he knew more about metalwork than someone who's been doing it professionally for decades. Miss Marple noted that Atkins's response carried a note of genuine anger that seemed disproportionate to the relatively mild nature of the questioning. The final interview of the day was with Sarah Larkin, who arrived accompanied by Mrs. Bantry and appeared to be on the verge of complete emotional collapse. Mrs. Larkin, Inspector Slack began gently, I know this is difficult, but we need to understand your son's condition and what he might have witnessed. I've told you everything I know, Sarah replied in a voice barely above a whisper. Tommy disappeared after supper and was found the next morning in a state of shock. Whatever he saw has left him unable to speak. You mentioned that Mr. Reeves had been visiting you recently, asking about your time working together in London. He seemed to think I should remember more about our professional relationship than I actually do. Those were difficult years for me, and many of the details have become blurred by time and grief. Inspector Slack leaned forward slightly. Did Mr. Reeves make any specific allegations about irregularities at the London establishment? Sarah's composure finally cracked. He kept implying that valuable pieces had gone missing or been replaced. But I was just a junior employee. I had no access to inventory records or financial information, yet he continued to press you for details. He seemed convinced that I must have noticed something suspicious, but I honestly couldn't help him. I finally told him that if he had serious concerns about past irregularities, he should contact the appropriate authorities rather than harassing someone who couldn't provide the information he wanted. As the interviews concluded and the participants departed, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of relationships and motivations that had been revealed. Each person questioned had demonstrated anxiety regarding Arthur Reeves's activities, and several had access to either the church or information about his investigative methods. Most significantly, George Atkins's defensive reactions and his inability to provide an alibi for the night of Reeves's death placed him in a particularly suspicious position. His professional relationship with the church brasswork, combined with his obvious nervousness about Reeves's inquiries, suggested he had the most to lose from any revelation about missing or replaced church property. The gray dust on Tommy's shoes took on new significance when considered alongside Atkins's metalwork activities, and Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the traumatized child might have fled first to the handyman's workshop before making his way to the pond area, where Reeves's body was eventually discovered. Chapter 6. Village Parallels. The following. Morning found Miss Marple in her usual chair by the drawing-room window, ostensibly engaged in the delicate work of darning one of her favorite cardigans. In reality, however, her attention was focused on the various threads of information that had emerged from Inspector Slack's interviews, threads that were beginning to form a pattern reminiscent of cases from her own considerable experience. Mrs. Bantry arrived shortly after 10, bearing the unmistakable air of someone who had spent considerable time reflecting on recent events and was now prepared to share her conclusions. "Jane, my dear," she announced, settling herself with evident satisfaction. "I've been thinking about this dreadful business with poor Mr. Reeves and that traumatized child, and I can't help but feel there's something familiar about the whole situation." Miss Marple looked up from her needlework with mild interest. "Familiar in what way, Dolly?" "Well, it reminds me rather of that unfortunate incident we had with old Mr. Henderson some years ago. Do you remember? He discovered that someone was embezzling from the church restoration fund, and just as he was about to expose the culprit, he suffered what appeared to be a heart attack in his garden." "I do recall Mr. Henderson's case," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, though it was later determined that his death was indeed natural. "Yes, but the pattern is remarkably similar, don't you think? A conscientious gentleman discovers evidence of theft or fraud, threatens to expose the wrongdoer, and then meets with a sudden and convenient death before he can act on his suspicions." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "And in both cases there was a witness whose testimony might have proven crucial, though in Mr. Henderson's case, old Mrs. Weatherby was too confused by her age to provide reliable information." Miss Marple set down her darning with careful precision. This was indeed the sort of parallel she had been contemplating, though she had not expected it to come from Mrs. Bantry. "You think someone deliberately silenced Mr. Reeves to prevent him from revealing evidence of theft?" "I think Mr. Reeves had discovered something that someone desperately wanted to keep secret," Mrs. Bantry replied with conviction. "And I think that someone decided murder was preferable to exposure and disgrace." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who appeared at the garden gate with the measured stride of someone bearing important news. "Good morning, ladies," he called as he approached the open French doors. "I've just come from another examination of young Tommy, and I believe there's been some progress in his condition." Miss Marple gestured toward an empty chair. "Please, doctor, do join us. Any improvement is most welcome news." Tommy has begun to speak again, though only in whispers and only about seemingly peripheral matters. Dr. Haydock accepted the offered seat with evident relief. "He's mentioned the dusty man several times and something about angry voices by the water, but when pressed for more specific details about what he witnessed, he becomes silent again." "The dusty man," Mrs. Bantry repeated with interest. Yes, and he's described this person as being very tall and wearing a hat like grandfather used to wear. According to Sarah, her late father always wore a flat cap, which provides some indication of the person's appearance. Miss Marple's attention sharpened considerably. Has Tommy mentioned anything else about this individual? He said the dusty man was shouting at the clockman, and that there was pushing and splashing. When I asked him to describe where he was during these events, he mentioned hiding under the crying tree's arms. The crying tree? I believe he's referring to the weeping willow by the pond. Children often personify natural features in that way. After the doctor's departure, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on Tommy's fragmentary revelations in the context of her own observations about human nature and criminal behavior. "Dolly," she said suddenly, "do you remember the incident with young Timothy Forsyte from several years ago?" Mrs. Bantry's expression grew thoughtful. The vicar's nephew, the boy who claimed to have seen something mysterious in the churchyard. Exactly. Everyone dismissed his story as childish imagination, but it turned out he had actually witnessed the church treasurer hiding evidence of his embezzlement in one of the old tombs. The child couldn't articulate what he'd seen clearly because he didn't understand the adult context of the activities he'd observed. You think Tommy might be in a similar situation? I think Tommy witnessed something that his young mind couldn't properly categorize or understand. Children often notice details that adults miss, but they lack the framework to interpret the significance of what they've observed. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the village with the contemplative air of someone assembling pieces of a complex puzzle. In my experience, she continued, when a child refers to someone as dusty, they're usually describing a person whose work involves materials that create particular types of residue. Tommy's mention of dust, combined with his presence near both the church area and the pond, suggests he observed someone whose occupation brings them into regular contact with metal filings, stone dust, or similar substances. Someone like George Atkins, Mrs. Bantry said quietly. Perhaps, though one must be careful not to reach conclusions based solely on circumstantial evidence. The afternoon brought an unexpected visit from the Reverend Clement, who arrived with the slightly harried expression of someone dealing with parish matters that extended well beyond the spiritual realm. Miss Marple, he began without preamble. I find myself in need of advice regarding a most disturbing discovery. Following Inspector Slack's suggestion, I've been conducting a thorough inventory of our church valuables, and I'm afraid Mr. Reeves's suspicions appear to have been well-founded. Miss Marple invited him to sit and poured tea from the pot she had optimistically prepared. What have you discovered, Vicar? Several pieces that were listed in our insurance documentation are either missing entirely or have been replaced with what appear to be inferior copies. The substitutions were so skillfully done that they weren't immediately apparent to casual observation. What sort of pieces are involved? Primarily brasswork, candlesticks, collection plates, decorative elements from the altar area. Items that a knowledgeable craftsman could reproduce convincingly, but which would have considerable value to collectors of ecclesiastical metalwork. Miss Marple considered this information with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of such revelations. Have you shared these findings with Inspector Slack? I plan to do so this afternoon. However, I felt it important to discuss the matter with someone who might understand the broader implications for our village community. And what do you believe those implications to be? The theft appears to have been conducted over an extended period by someone with regular access to the church and sufficient skill to create convincing replacements. That narrows the field of suspects considerably. As evening approached and the vicar took his leave, Miss Marple found herself standing once again by her drawing-room window, watching the shadows lengthen across the village green. The pattern that had been forming throughout the day was becoming increasingly clear, though certain crucial elements remained frustratingly elusive. The parallel she had drawn with previous cases suggested that Arthur Reeves's murder had been committed to prevent the exposure of systematic theft from the church. Tommy's testimony, fragmentary though it remained, pointed toward a confrontation between Reeves and his killer, a confrontation that had ended in deliberate murder disguised as accidental death. Most significantly, the combination of Tommy's description of the dusty man and the vicar's confirmation of missing brasswork created a compelling circumstantial case against someone with both the access and the skills necessary for such a crime. The question that remained was whether the evidence would prove sufficient to bring the guilty party to justice, and whether a frightened child could be persuaded to provide the testimony necessary to solve Arthur Reeves's murder. Chapter 7. Lemon. Biscuits and Trust. Chapter 7. Lemon Biscuits and Trust. Miss Marple had always believed that the most important conversations often took place over the simplest of refreshments. It was with this philosophy in mind that she prepared a particularly fine batch of lemon biscuits on the 5th morning following Arthur Reeves's death, taking special care to achieve the delicate balance of tartness and sweetness that she had learned was young Tommy Larkin's particular favorite. The boy arrived at her cottage shortly after 10, accompanied by his mother, who appeared to have aged considerably since the traumatic discovery of her son's condition. Sarah Larkin's face bore the strain of sleepless nights and constant worry, while Tommy himself remained pale and unusually subdued, though Miss Marple was pleased to note that he no longer maintained the complete silence that had so concerned. "Everyone. How very kind of you to invite us, Miss Marple," Sarah said, settling herself nervously on the edge of the offered chair. "Tommy has been asking about you, haven't you, dear?" The boy nodded solemnly but said nothing. His dark eyes fixed on Miss Marple with the intense scrutiny that children often employed when attempting to determine whether an adult could be trusted with important secrets. Miss Marple busied herself with the tea preparations, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understood that patience was often the most valuable tool in any delicate negotiation. She arranged the lemon biscuits on her second-best plate. The everyday china might suggest casual indifference, while the very best might seem too formal for a child's comfort. "I was just thinking this morning about the little boat you carry." "Tommy," she said conversationally as she poured tea for his mother, "Dr. Haydock mentioned it's quite beautifully made. Did someone special give it to you?" Tommy's hand moved instinctively to his pocket where the wooden toy resided in its usual place. "Daddy made it," he whispered so quietly that Miss Marple had to lean forward slightly to catch the words, "before he went to heaven." "How wonderful to have something so precious to remember him by," Miss Marple replied gently. "I imagine it's been a great comfort to you, especially when you've been frightened or worried." The boy's eyes brightened slightly at this understanding. "I hold it when the bad dreams come." Sarah Larkin shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Miss Marple, I'm not certain it's wise to encourage Tommy to dwell on recent events. Dr. Haydock feels that the best approach might be to help him forget whatever he thinks he witnessed." "Oh, but my dear," Miss Marple said mildly, offering Tommy the plate of biscuits, "in my experience, forgetting is rarely as effective as understanding. Children are remarkably resilient when they feel safe enough to share their worries." Tommy accepted a biscuit with obvious pleasure, and Miss Marple was gratified to see some of the tension leave his small shoulders. She had observed over many years that food offered in a spirit of genuine care had an almost magical ability to create trust between adults and children. "Tommy," she continued in the same gentle tone, "Doctor mentioned that you've spoken about seeing someone you called the Dusty Man. That must have been rather frightening." The boy's hand tightened around his biscuit, and for a moment, Miss Marple feared he might retreat into silence again, but after a long pause, he nodded slowly. "He was very angry," Tommy whispered, shouting loud like when Mr. Fletcher shouts at his dog for stealing bread. "And was anyone else there when the Dusty Man was shouting?" "The clockman was there. He was trying to make the Dusty Man stop being angry, but the Dusty Man wouldn't listen." Sarah Larkin leaned forward anxiously. "Tommy, darling, you mustn't—" But Miss Marple raised a gentle hand, her eyes never leaving the child's face. "It's quite all right, my dear Tommy. Can you tell Me, what happened after the shouting? The dusty man pushed the clockman very hard. The clockman tried to get away, but he fell into the water with a big splash. Tommy's voice grew smaller. And then there was lots of splashing, and the clockman went quiet. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken, but she maintained her calm demeanor. That must have been very frightening for you. What did you do then? I ran away first to the dusty place because I was scared and didn't know where else to go, but then I heard footsteps coming, so I hid in the shed until morning. The dusty place? Where the dusty man works. It smells like metal and makes your nose tickle. Tommy touched his nose unconsciously. I got dust on my shoes, and Mama always says not to track dirt in the house. Sarah Larkin had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. Miss Marple, I think perhaps we should— In just a moment, dear, Miss Marple said soothingly. Tommy, when you saw what happened to the clockman, were you close enough to see the dusty man's face clearly? The boy shook his head vigorously. No, miss, I was hiding behind the big tree trunk and he was on the other side of the water, but I could see him in the pond, like a looking glass. The water was very still before all the splashing started. I could see his shape in the water, but upside down. He was very tall and wore a hat like the picture of grandfather in Mama's bedroom. Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed this crucial detail. The positioning Tommy described would mean the child had seen not the murderer directly, but his reflection in the still water of the pond. Given the time of evening and the angle of the setting sun, such a reflection would indeed show a silhouette rather than clear facial features. Tommy, she said very gently, when you saw the dusty man's reflection in the water, was he doing anything particular? The boy's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment she feared she had pushed too hard. But after taking a large bite of his lemon biscuit for comfort, he nodded. He was checking to see if anyone was watching. He looked all around, very careful, like. That's when I got really scared and tried to make myself very small behind the tree. And then what happened? He picked something up from the ground and put it in his pocket. Then he walked away back toward the church. I waited a long time before I came out of hiding. Sarah Larkin had risen from her chair, her hands trembling visibly. Miss Marple, I must insist that we stop this questioning immediately. Tommy has been through quite enough. Mama, Tommy interrupted, looking up at his mother with surprising clarity. I want to tell Miss Marple, the bad dreams won't stop until I tell someone what really happened to the clockman. Miss Marple reached across and gently patted the child's hand. You've been very brave, Tommy, and very helpful. Sometimes grown-ups need to know what children have seen so they can make sure everyone stays safe. As mother and son prepared to leave, Tommy suddenly turned back to Miss Marple with the earnest expression of someone remembering an important detail. Miss Marple, he said quietly, the dusty man dropped something when he was picking up the other thing, something that made a little tinkling sound when it hit the stones. I wanted to look for it the next day, but then everyone was asking questions, and I got scared again. After their departure, Miss Marple remained seated in her drawing room, her mind working methodically through the implications of Tommy's revelation. The child's description of events painted a clear picture of deliberate murder rather than accidental death. His account of seeing the killer's reflection provided crucial evidence about the perpetrator's identity, while his mention of something being dropped and retrieved suggested there might be additional physical evidence. Most significantly, Tommy's description of fleeing first to the dusty place before hiding overnight perfectly explained the gray dust on his shoes and provided a clear link between the traumatized witness and the workshop of George Atkins. The afternoon sun slanted through her window as Miss Marple considered her next course of action, knowing that the time for gentle observation and patient gathering of information was rapidly drawing to a close. Chapter 8. The Pattern Revealed. Chapter 8. The Pattern Revealed. The vicarage drawing room had been transformed for the occasion, its familiar furniture rearranged to accommodate the gathering that Miss Marple had quietly requested. The September afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting gentle shadows across the assembled company as they partook of Mrs. Clement's carefully prepared tea service. Inspector Slack sat somewhat stiffly in his chair, no longer dismissive of Miss Marple's insights after Tommy's testimony had fundamentally altered his understanding of the case. Dr. Haydock occupied his usual position near the window, while the other attendees, Peter Wynne, Malcolm Ridley, Sarah Larkin, and George Atkins, displayed varying degrees of curiosity and unease. "I do hope you'll forgive the somewhat theatrical nature of this gathering," Miss Marple began with characteristic modesty, setting down her teacup with deliberate care. "But I felt it important that everyone understand the true circumstances surrounding poor Mr. Reeves's death." "Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said with newfound respect, "given young Tommy's testimony, I believe we all recognize this was no accident. Please proceed with your explanation." "Thank you, Inspector. You see, this case reminded me rather strongly of an incident that occurred in St. Mary Mead some years ago. A gentleman who discovered systematic theft from church funds and was murdered to prevent his revelations." She paused to survey the assembled faces, noting with interest the varying reactions to her words. George Atkins, in particular, had grown noticeably tense, his weathered hands gripping his teacup with unnecessary force. Mr. Reeves, with his expertise in clockmaking and metalwork, had discovered that valuable brass fittings were being removed from our church and replaced with skillfully crafted copies. The theft had been conducted so methodically that it might have continued indefinitely, had Mr. Reeves not possessed the technical knowledge to detect the substitutions. The Reverend Clement shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The inventory we conducted confirmed these suspicions. Several pieces are indeed missing or replaced." "Precisely, Vicar. Mr. Reeves's clockmaker's eye could distinguish between original brasswork and modern reproductions, no matter how skillfully made." Miss Marple turned her attention to George Atkins. "Your position as church handyman provided perfect access to these valuable fittings, Mr. Atkins. Over time, you had carefully removed original pieces and replaced them with copies of your own creation." Atkins started to rise from his chair. "Now, see here. I won't sit still for these accusations." "Please do remain seated," Miss Marple said with quiet authority. "The evidence is quite compelling. You see, Tommy Larkin witnessed the entire confrontation. By the pond, though he could only describe seeing your reflection in the still water, a tall man wearing a distinctive flat cap. His testimony is remarkably detailed." Inspector Slack leaned forward with professional interest. "Miss Marple, what exactly did the boy witness?" "Tommy saw Mr. Reeves confront Mr. Atkins about the theft. There was shouting. Then Mr. Atkins pushed Mr. Reeves into the pond, where he struck his head and drowned. What appeared to be an accidental fall was actually deliberate murder." "That's a lie," Atkins burst out, then seemed to realize his outburst had revealed too much. Miss Marple continued calmly. "After committing the murder, you behaved with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to covering his tracks. You checked carefully to ensure no witnesses, then collected evidence from the scene. However, you missed one crucial detail." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small brass button, its surface bearing the distinctive patina of age. "Tommy mentioned hearing something metallic fall and tinkle on the stones. This morning, Inspector Slack and I searched the area and found this button from your work coat. I suspect analysis will show it came from the same brass stock you've been using for your forgeries." Dr. Haydock examined the button with professional interest. The metal composition would certainly be traceable. "More significantly," Miss Marple continued, "Tommy's account explains the gray dust on his shoes. Terrified by what he'd witnessed, the boy fled first to your workshop, what he called the dusty place, before eventually hiding in his mother's garden shed." Sarah Larkin spoke for the first time since the gathering began. "You would have hurt my son to protect your secret." George Atkins's defensive posture finally crumbled completely. "I never meant for any of this to happen. he said in a voice barely above a whisper. 20 years I'd been taking care of that church. And what did I have to show for it? A few pounds a week in a cottage that needed constant repair? So you decided to supplement your income by stealing church property, Dr. Haydock observed. It wasn't really stealing, not the way I saw it. I was replacing everything with pieces I made myself. Good quality work, mind you. The church still had its fittings, and I needed the money for my old age. Atkins's voice grew stronger as he attempted to justify his actions. It would have worked perfectly if that clockmaker hadn't started poking around with his magnifying glass. But Mr. Reeves discovered your deception, Miss Marple said quietly. Tuesday evening, he cornered me after church services, said he'd figured out what I was doing, had evidence that would prove the substitutions, threatened to go to the police unless I confessed, and made full restitution. Inspector Slack made careful notes. So you arranged to meet him by the pond. I told him I had something to show him that would prove my innocence, some brass work hidden near the old shelter site. When he leaned over the water to look where I was pointing, I just pushed him to give myself time to think. I didn't mean for him to hit his head on that stone. And then you realized Tommy had witnessed everything, Miss Marple added. I heard rustling in the bushes and saw the boy running away. I thought about following him, making sure he couldn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Atkins looked directly at Sarah Larkin. But when I got near your cottage and saw how frightened he was, I realized I couldn't make things any worse than they already were. Yet you said nothing when Tommy was found in a traumatized state, Inspector Slack pointed out. I kept hoping he'd been too scared to understand what he'd really seen. Children imagine all sorts of things, don't they? Atkins's voice carried genuine remorse. I want you all to know I've been tormented by what I did. Mr. Reeves was a decent man who didn't deserve to die for my greed. As Inspector Slack formally arrested George Atkins and prepared to escort him away, Miss Marple remained seated in the vicarage drawing room, accepting the quiet thanks of the assembled company with characteristic modesty. Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock said as the gathering began to disperse. How did you first suspect Atkins was our culprit? Oh, it was really quite straightforward once one understood the pattern, she replied, beginning to gather her things. The gray dust on Tommy's shoes, combined with his description of a tall man in a flat cap, rather narrowed the possibilities. And of course, Mr. Atkins's defensive reaction to questions about the brasswork suggested he had considerable reason for concern. What about Tommy? Sarah Larkin asked with maternal anxiety. Will testifying against Mr. Atkins cause him further trauma? I believe the opposite, my dear. Now that the truth is known and justice will be served, Tommy should be able to put this dreadful experience behind him. Children are remarkably resilient when they feel safe and understood. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple made her way home through the familiar village streets, reflecting on the tragic chain of events that had begun with simple greed and ended in murder. The willow tree by the pond would continue to trail its branches in the still water, but the secret it had witnessed was finally revealed, bringing justice for Arthur Reeves and peace of mind for one small boy, who had been brave enough to remember what he had seen beneath its ancient boughs. Thank you for joining us for the Willow Tree Witness. Did you suspect the murderer before Miss Marple revealed the truth? Tell us in the comments, if you liked this mystery. Please subscribe to Cafe Stories and consider joining our membership for ad-free listening and exclusive tales. Until next time, this is Ailey signing off from Cafe Tales.